We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Welcome, fellow plebs. My name is Sean, and this is
Tribunus Plebis.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. And before we get going today, I want to take a moment here to thank Soong, who is one of our very generous, very kind, first day subscribers to the Buy Me a Coffee page. Thank you, Soong. I appreciate everything. You're awesome. Love you. And if anybody else is interested in supporting this project, there are links in the description of wherever you are watching or listening to this podcast. Please help us earn a little bit of money for all the work we do. We appreciate anything that you can give. Thank you. Today, I want to talk about sanctions, what they are, what they tell us they are meant to do, and what they actually do. But first, let me include something here. We won't be talking much about Russian sanctions today, I don't think. Not because they are any different. In fact, the sanctions imposed on the Russian people are pretty brutal. But rather, I didn't want this to kind of devolve into a Ukraine-Russia episode. So while I won't be beating the Russia-Ukraine war drum all episode, I did want to mention it, and we should keep in mind how all of this applies to Russia, and we should keep that in the front of our minds as we move along. Okay, so exactly what are sanctions? Well, I found a few different definitions, none of them wildly different from the others, and they all agree on the basic premise here. Sanctions are, essentially, nothing more than commercial and financial restrictions placed upon one nation or group of nations by another nation, or even an international organization. The goals of such actions are numerous, but the most common goal, in the most basic sense, is to get a country or government to make some sort of change. Some of the most prominent sanctions are things like restricting trade of a certain type of good, often military or industrial. On the industrial side of this thing, we might think about preventing an oil-producing country from importing replacement parts for its wells and refineries as an example. We might even see financial restrictions like what we are seeing right now with Russian sanctions, as they've been removed from the SWIFT system of international banking. Sanctions may even come in the form of a trade embargo, either of a specific commodity, perhaps oil again, or even an extremely broad trade embargo of nearly everything. But even the most extreme embargo situations, things like medical supplies and food staples, are often allowed through, at least technically. And so now that we all have an understanding of what sanctions are, at least in a real general sense, let's talk about the why of sanctions. The widely pronounced reason for sanctions is to convince a regime in control of a country to make some sort of change. For years in the United States, we have heard about how some country or another is undemocratic for some reason, authoritarian even. So then the US sanctions this other country to convince them to become more democratic. Sanctions can also be to stop something as horrific as a genocide or to stop a war, at least nominally. And I'm sure we will hit on the hypocrisy of a bunch of these statements in a bit, but let's give a little generosity here for now. This is, in fact, the argument that the government makes, that these sanctions are meant to change the minds of some foreign rulers and get them to be more democratic. But here's the thing, and it's really the thing I want people to really take from this episode, no matter how long I go on here. This is not how these ghouls want or expect these sanctions to work. Their goal is not to change the minds of presidents or other leaders. Sanctions are meant to degrade the lives of the poorest and most vulnerable human beings in the targeted country. It is to cause suffering so immense that it inspires the citizens to rise up and overthrow the government, fairly elected or not. And this is worth lingering on for a few seconds, I think. policy ghouls are telling us, in a sort of passive voice sort of way, that if we just impose sanctions on this other country, then they'll be nicer. That's what they tell us. What these sanctions actually do is they begin to starve, debase, degrade, torture, and murder poor people in a bid to create internal resentment. And I've talked about this in real life before, and nobody ever believes me. I guess they just don't believe that the people in charge are that out and out cruel. So I want to read you something. It's from a memo from Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, Lester D. Mallory, to his immediate superior, Roy Rubottom, and it is about a potential embargo aimed at Cuba. Quote, "If such a policy is adopted, it should be the result of a positive decision which would call forth a line of action which, while as adroit and inconspicuous as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba to decrease monetary and real wages, and get this, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government." End quote. To bring about hunger and desperation. And somebody had the gall to ask me why I speak so badly of these absolute monsters a while back. It's because of shit like this. Cruelty as policy. And for anyone thinking that, that was out of context, I'll have the full memo text up on the YouTube video if you want to check that out when it's up. In fact, line item 6 on the memo said this as well. Quote, "The only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship." End quote. The goal then, as we see, is to impose sanctions and make the common people suffer in a bid to get them to revolt. And to make this deeply sick and twisted depredation even worse is that it disproportionately affects those who were already marginalized in the affected country. And we can start with women and children, of course, as sanctions often do things like reduce both actual medicines and the ability to repair and replace key health infrastructure. And it also affects the availability of food and even fuel to run electrical plants, and just as importantly, it prevents replacement parts for key infrastructure like electrical plants, sewage, sewers, power lines, and so on. But it also goes a lot deeper than women and children. Think about the already marginalized, the indigenous populations, the internally displaced, the homeless, the poverty-stricken, the LGBTQ people, migrants, refugees, and the disabled and diseased. The sort of aid that these people need is almost never delivered, even despite the existence of humanitarian exemptions in the blockades. This becomes particularly perverse when the sanctions are placed by the UN and anyone on the Security Council can object to any particular humanitarian aid and effectively veto it. And to top this insanity off, they don't even have to justify their objection, and the Security Council refuses to even tell the suppliers of this aid exactly why it was rejected. So perhaps France felt like the tubes that the corn came in could be repurposed into weapons manufacture, and that's why they rejected it. Maybe the US just didn't think some items met the humanitarian exemption. Maybe some important portion of the facts was just unreadable. And maybe that corn, maybe it could have been put into bags instead of tubes, and that would have fixed it. And maybe with some small change that one item could be made to be definitely humanitarian aid. And maybe that fax could have been just resent, and all of these issues could have been cleared up, and people could have gotten the help that they need. But the people in charge are not interested in helping the common people, the poor, and the unfortunate. No, their goal is literally the exact opposite. They want to deny these people food, dignity, and happiness until they attack their fellow countrymen. And this is no secret. Even the United Nations itself admits it. Sadly enough, The UN actually recognizes the danger that these marginalized and vulnerable people face under the very sanctions that they themselves impose upon them. Even more sadly, the UN continues to impose the sanctions, and their only response to the self-diagnosed horrors that they impose on these vulnerable lives is to monitor them. Yep, just to watch them and take notes. One of the world's cruelest sociological studies ever conducted. Another sad and related reality of sanctions is that they often exacerbate the very issues which we are told that they are meant to ameliorate. Doubly sad is that this is on purpose and done for optic reasons. Let's look at Venezuela as a recent example. Sanctions there froze more than $17 billion worth of Venezuelan assets, and they prevented the sales of billions of dollars worth of trade credits, and they prevented the country from restructuring its foreign debt. Venezuela also saw a severe drop in oil sales due to these sanctions, which helped further crater the economy. The Trump administration put sanctions on the country, and over 2 years, they recorded over 40,000 extra deaths, which would not have happened otherwise, while nearly 500,000 more people struggled to find quality health care and were put in danger. The New York Times and Forbes both described these sanctions as, quote, not having much effect beyond the simply political, and they also said that the sanctions were, quote unquote, limited. How in the hell can anyone in the media say that freezing $17 billion in assets and billions more elsewhere is either limited or only political? You'd have to be either a liar or too stupid to do your job. There is no other option. And for a more recent example, let's look at Afghanistan. But before I go on, I do want us to keep in mind what I just said about Venezuela and what I'm about to say here about Afghanistan, because I will want to circle back and tie them together in a minute. So in Afghanistan, where the United States waged a destructive 20-year-long war for mineral and business rights while decimating the country's wealth, and, we pulled out a few months ago, the Afghans faced starvation due to U.S. sanctions imposed once we left. The United States froze $9 billion of Afghanistan's currency and cut it off from all world banking, rendering the country broke and helpless. It can't even operate its central bank or access any sort of foreign banking to help itself. And we see parallels here with Russia, too, right now. In the latest reports that I can find, somewhere between 90 and 98% of Afghans aren't getting enough to eat and are approaching true starvation levels of food. Between January 1st of this year and March 22nd, about 13,000 Afghan babies born in that period have died from malnutrition and hunger-related diseases and complications. In other words, the United States has murdered 13,000 babies with their policy choices. This means that something over 10%, that's more than 1 out of every 10 babies born, are killed by these sanctions. And who knows what sorts of developmental problems this will cause, or, at what astronomical rates they will occur down the line. Consider this. If this much starvation and this many dead babies and this much human suffering were caused by a natural disaster, money would flow in to aid these people. But because it's caused by sanctions, nobody does anywhere near enough to actually help all of these folks, because to do so, to save lives, to relieve the pain and suffering, well, that would directly oppose the United States, and, most importantly for the ghouls who run this country, it would counter the entire point of these sanctions themselves, which is to make poor people suffer and die. These deaths and this pain and this inhumanity are not unforeseen symptoms of a well-meaning policy. They are exactly the point of U.S. decision-making. The situation is so dire in Afghanistan that selling kidneys has become not just an option, but often a necessity. I found this article in Al Jazeera and it's just heartbreaking. A mother sold her kidney for $2,700 because her children had no food and were being treated for malnourishment. But that fix wasn't enough to ride out these sanctions. As of the end of February, her husband was beginning the process of finding a buyer for one of his kidneys. From the article, and please pardon the pronunciations, quote, "On the outskirts of Herat lays Seishanba Bazaar, a village made up of hundreds of people displaced by years of conflict. Known as One Kidney Village, it's where dozens of residents have sold their organs after word spread among destitute families of the money that they could make. From one family, 5 brothers sold a kidney each in the last 4 years, thinking that it would save them from poverty. We are still in debt and as poor as we were before," said Ghulam Nabi, showing off his scar. End quote. What in the fuck are we doing to these people? Another man in this story spoke about how he sold his kidney in desperation, but now regretted that he could no longer work due to the constant pain and the inability for him to lift anything of any significant weight due to a less than stellar surgery and recovery. Also from the story, quote, "Mother of 3 Aziza, meanwhile, is waiting for her opportunity after meeting a hospital staffer who is trying to match her with a donor. My children roam on the streets begging," she told AFP, tears welling. "If I don't sell my kidney, I will be forced to sell my 1-year-old daughter." End quote. If you're still not angry, and you're still trying to convince yourself that what we are doing to Afghanistan is in any way a righteous move, then friend, you need to take a step back, re-listen to these past couple of minutes here, and reassess. And that probably sounds cruel and judgmental. And, I guess maybe it is. But I don't understand. I still love you, but I just don't get it. Alright, so I've depressed myself now. It's heavy shit, right? And I find that for many, the impulse to sanction a country comes just as easily as the impulse to go to war with it, right? Like, war is this brutal, death-bringing catastrophe. But let some foreign nation do something wrong, and half the country is on their chairs screaming for a war that they, 1, won't fight in, and 2, will only watch from halfway around the globe. The other half of the country is on their chairs screaming, "No, just kill them with sanctions." Starvation, not bullets, is the new peace chant, I guess. Neither side realizes that they're washed with the blood of innocents as they scream their violent urges to their leaders. This is absolutely insane. Literally right now, right at this very moment, there are people penning op-eds and tweeting about a no-fly zone in Ukraine, which would lead to a war with Russia. And right at this very moment, just as many people are calling for the same sorts of murderous sanctions that will kill so many Russian civilians. Well, like I mentioned in the beginning, sanctions have already started in Russia. Trade embargoes, removal from the global SWIFT program, and so on. Russians are already feeling it. The elite Russians aren't. They'll be fine, trust me. But the poor will suffer what they must, just as they always do. So, alright. Sorry, I got a little sidetracked there. I wanted to tie together the thoughts I had on Venezuela from years back and Afghanistan now, and the string to tie that together is a secondary result of sanctions. A president like Trump puts crippling sanctions on Venezuela. A president like Biden puts crippling sanctions on Afghanistan or Russia. And then those economies collapse, and both of these shit presidents, both of these monstrous, evil, heartless, sociopathic, power-mad ghouls, they stand up and they say something like, their economy collapsed because they aren't democratic enough. Which is, of course, a bald-faced lie. It is, in fact, a lie which is so obvious and so wrong that it is told, completely without concern for the ethical implications, in full disregard of those who have been affected. And you know what's even worse in these lies? These plainly obvious lies? These lies which they aren't even trying to mask? The worst thing is that so many of us just believe them. We just believe them. These lies are they're just so brazenly lies. Like, these people stand you out in a downpour and tell you, no, it's not raining. And you smile and put the umbrella away. And then you spend the next week justifying being soaked to the skin and justifying why you believed that lie. And now, at this point, I don't know. I got a little carried away, I guess, and maybe lost the thread a little, so sorry. Sorry about that. This stuff just makes me a little upset. Okay, so let's just skip these next few notes here because I'm a little confused on where I was, and I'll probably just be repeating myself. So I'll just go on to the next big question here. Or maybe the one big question. And that is, do sanctions work? And I mean, even considering what we said about the lies that the presidents tell us and policymakers tell us and the reality of sanctions, whether we take the best version or the worst, do sanctions actually engender the change which they are supposed to? Short answer, almost always, no. What? All of that, all of the starving people, collapsing economies, immense suffering, crime, selling kidneys, all those dead babies, and sanctions don't work? Nope. In fact, they often create the exact opposite reaction as the one they are supposedly aiming for. Let's say you have an authoritarian ruled country and you say, boy, we'd sure love those people to have more freedom. And then you roll in and you cripple their economy with sanctions. What do you think is likely to happen? The authoritarian just says, oh, boy, geez, these people are really suffering. They're really being hurt. Let me just give up all my power. The fact is that places like this are the least likely to succumb to sanctions. They are already usually relatively segregated from global trade, and economic attacks just drive them deeper into the arms of friendly countries and just causes the pains we talked about before for the populace. But as we mentioned a few times, these pains are the actual point of the sanctions, right? The idea is that this suffering will drive a populace to rebel against their leaders, okay? But here's the thing. People just aren't that stupid, uneducated, or cut off from information. When the situation in a country suddenly collapses and people begin to suffer immensely, those same people start to wonder why this is happening. And the leaders of that country are, unsurprisingly, more than happy to tell them that the reason why is economic sanctions put upon them by the United States. And the people, even if they don't trust their leaders, they can actually verify this with Google or whatever other apps that they use. It's crazy, right? You start to starve and you Google why, and the result is the United States is starving you. So who do you hate? Probably the people preventing food from being shipped to your country. Even in a super repressive country where they might be reluctant to distribute news that isn't pure propaganda, they will not be shy to flood the country with foreign news stories about what a sanctioning country is doing to them. In fact, far more often than not, imposed sanctions result in a sanctioned populace rallying around their own countrymen, and it simply generates hate towards the outside sanctioning country. Usually the United States. Studies by Wood, 2008, and Pexon and Drury, 2009, both found that, quote, sanctions lead to a significant increase in the use of repression and political terror by target regimes in order to stabilize the political environment and suppress dissent. Sanctions lead to a decrease in overall physical integrity rights, increased economic and political discrimination against minority ethnic groups, and a deterioration of public health conditions in target states. End quote. Sanctions rarely, if ever, change the actions of a regime. That's just the reality here. If you Google articles about this, or even academic studies, a lot of them, if not most or nearly all of them, will say something along the lines of sanctions inadvertently make things even worse rather than creating change. But I'm arguing that these sanctions do exactly what those who impose them know, expect, and want them to do. They cause human misery amongst the most vulnerable people in the country being targeted. And let's take a look at a few popular examples of sanctions supposedly working and talk about the errors in thinking that lead to this terrible take. Iraq in the 90s. Sanctions there decimated Iraq's economy and led to horrific suffering of its people. By the end of that decade, more than a third of Iraqi children were malnourished. At the end of the decade, the Red Cross was reporting that the Iraqi economy, once a shining star of the region, was destroyed. And nothing changed. Saddam Hussein didn't care. He always got his money and never wanted for food or medicine. But millions of Iraqis suffered immense hardships. It was this suffering that Leslie Stahl asked Madeleine Albright about, and here's that question and answer.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
It was worth it. America. Eventually, Saddam fell. But not due to sanctions. It was due to a military invasion led by the United States. We can go back just a little bit further in time to two African nations which were supposedly successfully sanctioned. The first is Rhodesia, a white supremacist state at the time, which is now known as Zimbabwe. Rhodesia declared its independence from Britain so that it could maintain its white minority rule. The United Nations imposed a relatively strong embargo on Rhodesia, which lasted for over a decade, but failed to engender change. Rhodesia eventually fell, but not to sanctions, but rather to a concerted rebel guerrilla war heavily financed and supported by the USSR and other surrounding countries. The other big African supposed success story was South Africa, another white minority rule country under the brutal apartheid regime. This one right here might be the single most cited situation where they say sanctions worked, but let's look into it a little bit. Sanctions started in 1962, but they were fairly weak because they had huge carve-outs for products that Western countries wanted, which is kind of self-defeating, right? Like, here's an embargo on your country, except all the stuff we want to buy from you. Diamonds, gold, and other important minerals weren't covered by the sanctions. And this was a lot of the South African economy. Not only that, but the sanctions pushed South Africa to develop self-sufficient food systems, energy systems, and even turned them into arms exporters. The sanctions didn't even discomfort the white rulers, but they did cause huge amounts of suffering amongst the oppressed black population of the country. In fact, I'm going to read you this part of an article that I found, and honestly, I lost the citation to it, but it talks about what happened due to these sanctions in a few sectors. Quote, facing an embargo on energy imports, it developed a world-class system to make oil from coal. Once dependent on arms imports, it ramped up production and became a net exporter. And for all the pressure and cutoffs, South Africa was still able to develop its first nuclear device in 1982. And by 1989, it had 6 bombs. End quote. The sanctions just made South Africa more independent, at least the white population and leaders anyway. But to the point here, the apartheid regime began to fall in the early 90s, after a full 3 decades of sanctions. But were the sanctions actually the cause? No, they weren't. The real cause was a huge change of internal politics, culminating with the release of Nelson Mandela, and probably even more importantly, a titanic change in international politics with the fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall. The problem we are running into here is that there is a large error when deciding whether or not sanctions have actually worked, and that error is considering force meaning that the sanctioned country was attacked or invaded by the sanctioning parties as sanctions, quote-unquote, working. The error is that people see country X get sanctioned for some reason, let's just say being undemocratic, and they are sanctioned for a decade but don't budge. And then the sanctioning body sends a military force into country X to force a regime change. Many observers and studies actually count this as a successful outcome for sanctions. The reality is, though, that this is not a success. The military invasion was what forced the change, not the sanctions. And I think that this sort of failed thinking is incredibly important to keep in mind and highlight whenever somebody says sanctions work and they roll out some large percentage of success. They aren't actually citing sanction successes by and large. They are citing military interventions, global political power shifts, or some other factor for the change that they see. They are making a sort of correlation error. Let me also throw in here the biggest failure of them all for American sanctions: Cuba. I hope that we remember the memo I quoted way back in the beginning here and consider this. The embargo placed on Cuba by the U.S. has caused untold pain and suffering on many people on the island, all in a purposeful bid to degrade them to the point of rebellion. But like I just said, people know the cause of a lack of trade and lack of financial opportunities on the global stage, and it's the United States. The embargo and sanctions has been going on for 60-something years, I think. Even the UN General Assembly is horrified by this ongoing action and has repeatedly and overwhelmingly voted to end it. But, America answers to nobody at all with their reign as global hegemon. Stated U.S. goals have still not been met. A total failure. Or, I guess total success maybe, since the point is to make Cuban people suffer. Right now, the U.S. has official sanctions on 6 countries as far as I can tell: North Korea, Cuba, Iran, Syria, Venezuela, and Russia. And none of them have worked. The U.S. also has sanctions on quote-unquote individuals of at least 21 countries. And this is a bit more nebulous because most of these sanctions on individuals are not really individuals. They are on groups of people. Groups tagged with terms like people responsible for undermining democratic elections, or some other vague terminology to allow the broadest possible sanctioning. These individual sanctions are, in actual practice, sanctions against actual countries. The United Nations, NATO, the IMF, the World Bank, and numerous other ghoulish covens of the morally bankrupt international order impose their own sanctions as well, mostly against broadly defined individuals again, but also against countries. The sheer number of these sanctions made it hard to count, not to mention that they are often levied by committee and subcommittees, which makes it even harder to track them down. But the reason why I mentioned all these groups is because they are all either just flat out controlled by or so heavily influenced by the United States that they are in, actual effect, actually controlled by the United States. This power of the United States is nearly totally unchecked. So all of those international organizations and groups of allied countries and sanctions, those are, in all reality, United States sanctions. I didn't want to leave here without mentioning that, because this is pretty much all our fault. So as I start to wind down and let the subject drop, mercifully for many of you, dear listeners, I'm sure, let me just recap some bullet points before I kind of make my final argument here. Economic sanctions lead to an increase in poverty, and the already deprived sections of the population feel the most impact. For the most part, sanctions fail to achieve their aims, and elites manage to negotiate the adverse effects to a far greater level than the poorer citizens. Sanctions worsen wealth inequality, and it impacts ordinary people more than whatever the leaders of these countries were doing before the sanctions. They tend to hurt rural and non-industrial areas more, as resources are then refocused towards political power centers and industrial areas. Sanctioned governments point out that the negative effects of the economy are from the sanctions, aka an outside attack to prevent the population from revolting. The negative impact that sanctions have on economic growth affects women, minority communities, and other marginalized groups to a greater extent. They have a significant negative impact on the living standards and humanitarian situation of the population in the sanctioned state. They impact access to humanitarian aid, which leads to less aid getting through, which exacerbates the poverty. The results of sanctions, economic hardship, misrule, conflicts, they all manifest and defeat the purpose of the sanctions. Okay, so I guess it's time to wrap this up. Sanctions harm millions to tens of millions of people, or even more depending on where they are being placed against. They lead to death tolls that often outpace the rates that would be found in actual wars, if we can believe that. Yet they very rarely work for their supposedly intended purposes. Policy goals are never met by these sanctions, and the policymakers know this. The vast majority, if not all sanctions enacted by the United States, or under their watchful eyes, are done for no bigger reason than political appeasement at the local level. Presidents enact sanctions to mollify voters, in other words, not because they actually work. Our political leaders desperately want to appear bold and brave and decisive, and sanctions are a way to do that while also having virtually no impact on their own citizens. They don't have to send little Billy off to war. They frame higher prices for goods and oil as our patriotic duty, and they use their heavy sanctions as something to run on with whatever hawkish wing of their party demands blood for their votes. Cynically, they will enact these sanctions which destroy the lives of ordinary citizens in the target countries, and then wax poetic about how much they care about those same people whose lives they are actively choosing to destroy. All of the theories of how sanctions will lead to regime change, or really any change at all, are spurious at best. People living under a tyrannical regime who are suffering horrors, they face immense challenges in throwing off the yoke as it stands before sanctions. After sanctions, the situation is even worse. They are more deprived than before and even less likely to collectively resist. Not only that, but now the enemy has become not just bad leadership, but a foreign adversary to rally against. Another theoretical result of sanctions is that the elites of the sanctioned country will revolt themselves and overthrow the current leader. But this misses something incredibly important and incredibly obvious. By definition, these elites benefit from the current system and by who is in power. Why would they risk that? And the last thing here is that final and ultimately cruel theory that by making the lives of the poor so bad that they actually rebel, part of this theory is that by causing economic hardship and loss, that the sanctioned country will no longer be able to pay its security forces. But again, this misses a crucial point. The leadership knows this plan, and literally the last thing it will stop paying for is internal security. In fact, many studies have shown that internal security increases many times over to protect their status, even to the point of allowing unaffiliated militia-style death squads free rein to territories too far away from the power centers. The cruelty never ends with these ghouls. Sanctions are cruelty. Sanctions do not work. Sanctions are murder. And that, my friends, is the end of the episode. I hope all of that made sense and that you liked it. If you want to really help us out, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, Tribunus Plebis Media. We have a Buy Me a Coffee page where you can subscribe for a low fee and follow along, or just make one-time donations. Any little bit helps. You can also rate and review on iTunes. There are links for all of these things in the description. And that's it. Thank you guys. Thank you for listening. I love you all.